Hello guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to a sort of not top five but a video of a list. Anyway, this is influenced by um, uh, the YouTube channel Horror Hands. He did a video saying 5 horror films that defined my childhood. So here's my 5 um, horror films that defined my childhood. Obviously, I'm quite a bit older than Horror Hands, so mine's going to be slightly different to his, because obviously his childhood will be um, a little bit sort of older than mine. So he might have had a few titles in there that were a bit more sort of like, I don't know, modern in those times. But these were modern in these times. But yeah, mine was a little bit different, and some of the titles were maybe quite older because obviously we didn't get to see much horror films when we were young. Cinemas were a real treat, and when we were young, we weren't taken to see horror films. We were taken to see Superman, or we were taken to see Jungle Book, things like that. Now, there was no VHS when I was a little lad, but one of these films, it was my first VHS. Actually, it wasn't VHS, it was a Betamax tape. When we first got a video player at home, we got a Betamax. We didn't have a VHS, we had Betamax. But I'll get to that. But I'm going to start this with the first horror film I saw as a youngster, and it's sort of like really had an impact on me because I remember it so much that I couldn't. Every time it was on, I want to see it, and it was The Incredible Shrinking Man. So this was the very first horror film I ever saw, and it's a monster. It's a monster film, and it's about this guy who goes out on this boat trip with his girlfriend, and they come across this mysterious fog. And she's okay because she's in the boat asleep, but he's sleeping on the deck, and he gets infected by this sort of radiation sort of fog that's going over him, and he starts to shrink, and he gets down to like about that sort of big eventually, and he gets lost in first of all they keep him in like a doll's house in the house, but then eventually he gets sort of lost. He gets attacked by the cat, and he gets lost and ends up in the cellar, and nobody can find him. So it's survival, him trying to find his way back up to sort of like his wife, who's obviously the relationship is totally and utterly gone. But yeah, he's trying to get back to there. But and he comes across all these struggles. He comes across a household spider, which is obviously it's just like a normal spider to us, but to him it was ginormous. And I think they actually use a tarantula. When I see some of the clips, it's actually a tarantula. And he also comes across the cat and all these other sort of survival horror things like lack of food and things like that. So it's a survival horror, and it absolutely it grabbed me. It didn't scare me or anything like that. It just sort of grabbed me in the sense of like, wow, this is just amazing. It was just like how they got this guy so small. I knew nothing about special effects. I was probably 5 or 6 or something like that when I first saw it. And I remember because it was Christmas time. This was shown quite frequently at Christmas times when Christmas in the UK used to come in the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s and maybe early 80s. TV was a real important thing. So you used to get really sort of films that were every other program was a film, or it was like a Christmas special. There was no rubbish on the TV at Christmas time. It was the best sort of 2 weeks of the year for television, and that's where I used to get all my old Law and Hardys, because every Christmas they used to show them. So we didn't have VHSs, we didn't have any videos or anything like that then. We had only had the television, 3 channels, BBC One, BBC Two and ITV. And if you were lucky, you'd have a fourth channel, which was a regional one. We had Angular when we were down there, which was just an outspit of ITV. Up here in Yorkshire, you'd have had Yorkshire Television. So you'd have had your sort of like local area TV. But that's all we had. And it was like, you would sit down and I'd mark off all the programs, and we'd buy the Radio Times every single Christmas. It's the only time we'd ever buy it. And we used to mark off everything with a little star next to it, what I wanted to watch. And I always looked out for these strange little movies like Incredible Shrinking Man, Tom Thumb, or Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, things like that. The things that were a little bit sort of scary, a little bit spooky, because it just drew me to it. And I just sort of like, wow, this was so cool. And I just absolutely loved everything about this film. And I would watch it every time it was on. It was so cool. So I actually own it now on video myself, on Blu-ray, released by Arrow. And it's so cool to have this film. It's such an important film to me, and it's my first ever horror film that I saw. So we're going to jump a little bit older now, probably in the sort of 70s and that. And if I was lucky, I was allowed to stay up later weekends, and sometimes I got to see horror films. Got to see some horror films. It would either be Universal horror or Hammer, and in amongst that, the very first Hammer film I ever saw, and it really scared me, was The Reptile. This was the first Hammer film I ever saw, and it just absolutely petrified me. There's a part in the film when there's like these bells sort of ringing in the film. I think it's sort of like almost like a chime bell, and I used to hear them in my woods at night time. I think, oh my God, I can hear the reptile's going to come and all this, and it really terrified me for nights. It really did. It really did me sort of like no good. Well, in the long run, it did me the world of good, because now I absolutely love horror films. But back in the day, it was like, wow. And this was really, really scary. So I know it's not scary now, but back then, I was absolutely petrified of it. And it reminded me for years and years and years of Reptile. And it was, for quite a while, it was my favourite Hammer film, simply because it was the only one I really knew. But my dad used to let us sit up sometimes and watch these horror films, and occasionally we would get a few good ones on. There were, a lot of the time, you wouldn't get like the big titles like Curse of Frankenstein or Dracula. You would get things like Taste the Blood of Dracula and things like that, which again were really amazing and stuff like that. But you never got the iconic ones, I think, because they were maybe a bit more expensive for these TV channels to actually pay for. I don't know, to show. So we got things like this. But I loved it, and I really loved it. And another one I used to see with him was called The Nanny. That was another one that was one of my first sort of Hammer films I saw. And that was terrifying as well, because I loved my nan. She put me right off my nan. But yeah, this I remember really, really well. The Reptile. That's my first Hammer film. But in the late 70s, early 80s, along came... It must have been 80s. Along came, or very early 80s, video cassettes. And like I said, we managed to get a Betamax. Now, we had a Betamax with some blank tapes, but there was a shop down the bottom of our road called Phillips, which was a newsagent, and it used to sell films. And so we used to buy some films from there. But then my dad was given some films from one of his friends from work. He used to work at British Aerospace, and from the social club, they gave him like a group some VHSs, but they weren't in the boxes. They were in like those horrible library book boxes. They were in them. It wasn't in the proper box, you know, like with the pictures on it. So we got these films and opened one up, and it was Dawn of the Dead. And so we had a copy of Dawn of the Dead, which it was like, wow, you know, I've never heard of it, but it sounded interesting. Dawn of the Dead. So we put it on, me and my sister, and we watched it, and it was absolutely gory as hell. You know, and I felt a little bit wheezy at some points. It's like, oh my God, this is really gory. But we also thought, how cool is this? And like some of the other cassettes, you know, you'd put a bit of sellotape over it until you can use it to record over. But this one, we would not record over. We kept it, you know, and this was my first Betamax tape we ever owned, and it was Dawn of the Dead, and this is the original one from 1970. Oh, what year was it now? Actually, can't remember again, but it's a 1970s film, and it kind of like it must have been something like 77 or 78. It must have been something like that, or even earlier. But I was absolutely drawn to it. Totally uncut, because it was not under any certification, because when these cassettes first started, there wasn't no certification on them, no 18s, 15s, nothing like that. Didn't exist. You got them in the cinema, but not on cassettes. You could have gone down to your local newsagent, and which I did, and I bought some other sort of like films that were like certificate X's, but I was allowed to buy them because they weren't certificated. And I remember buying a couple of films from there, Death Wish being one of them, and stuff like that. And it's just like we managed to get some films from there for like, you know, because we used to have them on the rack. They used to be quite pricey. They were like £10 or £20, but I used to save up my pocket money. But this one we got for free, and it stood with me. So, and it was my first ever gore film, and I'm sure this was on one of the Video Nasty lists, probably section 3 or 2 or something like that. But yeah, it was my first sort of like real exploitation gory horror. So that really stands for me, and a really important film, and what a great film it is. The second in the original Romero trilogy, obviously Night of the Living Dead and Day of the Dead, which I saw in the cinema in the 80s. But you know the story behind that one, but that doesn't go under my childhood. That's more of my sort of like teenhood. But this one is one that I had in my childhood, and it stays with me, and it's a fantastic film. Not my favourite zombie film, but it stays with me since. Really, really cool. And one regular that was always on TV. It's a Hammer film. The one that was always on, that they could always manage to show at least once or twice a year on the TV, was Dracula AD 1972. And so this is why this is one of my favourite Draculas, just because of its history to me. It's not one of the best films, I get that, but it is to me, it's one of my favourites, because when I watch it, it takes me right back to watching it on the TV, because it was so different. It was not set, it wasn't a gothic horror. It was set in so-called modern time London, when, you know, you recognise some things like Carnaby Street and things like that, places where I've been to and stuff like that. And I recognised areas of it, and so I had that sort of connection to it, and Dracula was quite formidable in it, and I found him quite scary as a character, and I got really sort of like into the Dracula thing. And I used to have a Top Trumps Hammer Top Trumps. I don't know if anybody remembers them, but I used to have a Hammer set of Top Trumps. So when I was young, all that I really had was the Hammer films on TV. The odd comic I used to buy, the House of Hammer, but that I never got them very often. But I used to have Top Trumps set of cards of Hammer horror, which was really cool. I no longer have that, which is a shame. and I know don't think I will no longer have the comics. I have looked for them, but I can't find them. But yeah, this was a great memory for me, because again, it's one I used to watch on my own when I was a little bit older, sort of 10, 11, and I was able to sit up later at night. Mum and Dad sometimes gone out, or that, you know, we had a babysitter let us come down and watch it, or they were at home in upstairs and I'd sneak down to watch the telly, or even sometimes just watch it when it was on. It used to be on quite late on a Saturday night or something like that. You'd find it on BBC Two quite late at night, and this was quite regular. I know it used to come up like nearly twice a year, and so I used to watch that every time it come on. So that holds a dear memory to me. And last but not least is one that came out in 1975, and it was really popular. And it was one of those films that word by mouth, everyone talked about. You've got to see this, you've got to see that, you know. And again, I was too young for it, but I bought the book from a second-hand bookstore in Now Indoor Market, and I just thought, oh, I've got to see this film at some point. And obviously, like I said, VHS came along, or Betamax for us, and I eventually got to see the film, and it was Jaws. And this was such a revelation again for me. It was like, because it was so real. It wasn't zombies, it wasn't vampires, it wasn't monsters of the night. This was a monster that lived in the sea, you know, and it's just like, Jesus, and it seemed so real when I watched it, and it was absolutely terrifying because it just seemed so real. And when things are like that, now I think that's what intensifies a lot of horror films, and that's why I think slasher films become really popular, because although you had like a killer, a masked killer, it still seems so real. Whereas when you watch Dracula and things like that, where most of the time it's based right back down into the Victorian times or Georgian times, or even older than that, it's like, yeah, it's a lifetime ago. They're not here anymore, but sharks were, and it absolutely began my love affair with sharks. I just thought, wow, what an amazing creature, how immense. So any documentary used to come on TV, David Attenborough or anything like that, I would make sure I try and watch it, as long as it's about sharks, you know. My mum used to say, Geoff, this programme's on, it's about sharks. I'll come running down to watch it and all this sort of thing. And I just got fascinated with sharks. Sharks and penguins when I was little. I don't know why. I still love them both today, but they were my go-to sort of like favourite animals, you know, wildlife animals. And this was absolutely amazing. It was gory, and it was like, my God, the shark's just bit this leg off or whatever, you know. And I kind of, it was a love and hate ending to me. I loved the ending, but I hated it because I didn't want Jaws to die, because I thought it's just an animal surviving, you know. That's how I look at animals. So I felt sorry for him. But there again, so's the guy. He's just trying to survive, not become shark bait. But there we go. But yeah, that was a major influence in my childhood, and it also became one of my favourite films of all time, until Alien came along, and I managed to see that, and then that changed everything again. But I've not included that in this top 5, just because you all know how important that film is to me and my love of horror. But these films here, I can honestly say, have made me a horror fan, because these are films that I remember from my childhood that sort of really influenced me into really liking horror films. You know, it was just like, wow, these films are just amazing. And it all started with that one. Cheers, guys.